I appreciate that. It could have been a lot worse. There's so many people here today that I know, and it's great to see all of you. But for those of you that I don't know, let me just tell you a couple things about me. I'm an old school kind of guy. I mean, look at me. Somewhere along the road to retirement, I got old. I hate it when that happens. And secondly, I'm Scottish. I can't help it. That's just who I am. I'm one of those guys that my whole life, I had to hold a newspaper in my hand every morning to get the day started right. And then when I retired and Sherry retired, we took a trip across the country and we were going to be gone at least a couple months. There was no way I was going to pay for them to stack up newspapers on my front porch while I was gone, so I canceled my subscription. And then I discovered you can read the newspaper on the internet. I told you I was an old school guy. And not only that, you don't even have to pay for a subscription. You can read the allocated number of articles every month, and when the News and Observer cuts you off, you can start reading the Charlotte Observer. It's great stuff, great stuff. So on January 20th, it was after Whit asked me to speak to you today, and I was trying to think of what I might begin to tell you. I came across an article in the News and Observer. It was about a co-ed from Chapel Hill. She had graduated in May of 2014 with a degree in psychology. She was a very, very good student, and she was one of those people that volunteers to help in everything. Well, in December of 2014, less than 6 months after she graduated, she was volunteering in the state of Georgia when she committed suicide. And I read that article and I had three reactions to it. Number one, obviously, what a sad and tragic story. Number two, we never know what's going on in someone's mind. And number three, we all have mental health issues. There was one statistic in that article that especially caught my attention. It said that 33% of young adults ages 18 to 25 self-report mild or moderate depression. 18 to 25, that's essentially our college kids. And I've always been real big about saying the world has changed. The world really has changed. I remember back to my days as a student at Davidson College and at Wake Forest Law School. I got depressed, but it was only the night before a paper was due or the week of final exams. And the rest of the time, life was a bowl of cherries. And I guess that may be the topic of another speech, maybe. And I'm looking at Ed, maybe not.
Careful about what you say.
The truth of the matter is that as a society, we don't really talk about our problems. Now, I guess you could ask the question, should we? Last week, I was watching a replay of a commencement address given by Lou Holtz. Now, those of you that are old school remember Lou Holtz is a coach, most famously, I guess, of Notre Dame, where he won at least one national championship. But those of you that are really old school will remember Lou Holtz as a coach at NC State University. Lou Holtz said, we should never talk about our problems. Why? Because 90% of the people around us don't care. And the other 10% are glad you have them. Well, I think he had a little bit of tongue-in-cheek when he said that, and it's probably a good idea. I have a great example of that principle for you. In the 26 years that I served as a district court judge, I had a wonderful relationship with the people in Whit Gibson's clerk's office. Whit did an absolutely amazing job of assembling people there. Those women, there was only one man other than Whit, in that clerk's office were great to work with. They always had a smile on their faces. They always were so helpful to me. They never had a bad day. Everything was just perfect. But it wasn't until I'd been a judge for a long, long time and I think really developed close personal friendships with them that I discovered they had problems too. They had tragic deaths in their families. They had health issues. They had financial dilemmas. And they certainly had parenting issues. My point is that they were not unlike all of us. And I would be willing to bet that if we went around this room today and let everyone speak, every single one of us could tell about some life experience that happened to them that permanently affected who you are today. And I'd also be willing to bet that most of those experiences come from your childhood. And I think that's why, during the time that I was a judge, I was especially interested in our children. I was, and I think I continue to be, especially in my retirement, which is great, an eternal optimist. And I've always said that all of our problems in Scotland County could be solved in just a generation if we just took care of every kid that we have here in the county. Unfortunately, in court, we get to see in gruesome detail, some of those things that impact our lives. One of the things that I think drove me away from being a judge was my experience in civil court in Hope County and the military cases that we have there. And I don't know how many of those cases I tried, but they all fell into the same pattern. We have young people serving in the military, and they come to Fayetteville and Fort Bragg, young dads, young mothers, just out of high school so many times, and small children. And what happens is the dads get deployed. And at first that was Iraq, and then it was Afghanistan, and of course some of them go multiple times, and they get over there, and life is tough. I mean, every day they worry about, am I going to step on an IED? And of course a lot of them do, and they come back without legs and arms, and it's tough. But every single one of them comes back with post-traumatic stress disorder. And when they come back, they're so excited about coming, and they want to be good parents. But every time someone closes the door, they jump. And every time things get a little stressful, they lose it. And quite frankly, those are not qualities that make good parents. So those cases become incredibly difficult. Speaking of parenting, I think I can speak for everyone here in the room today when I say, when we have our children, we want the very best for our children. And when they're born, we think they can be anything that they want to be, whether it's a professional athlete or president of well, I don't know, maybe not president, who wants to be president now? But anything. And then as they get a little older and you start seeing the reality, you start checking things off the list. Well, maybe that's not going to happen, and maybe this. In my case, I just knew that I had a daughter who was going to play college basketball. My career was real short, but I wanted that for my daughter. And I really thought it was going to happen. I mean, she was so competitive. She was big and strong and had great hand-eye coordination. And her role model was Tyler Hansbrough, and she played basketball like Tyler Hansbrough. She was devastating in high school. And then one day I woke up and I realized she also inherited my gene for quickness. And I knew Division I was out of the question. But really, we shouldn't have huge expectations for our children, except that we want them to be happy. And in that regard, I saw a quote that I thought was just too good to pass up here. It said, "When it comes to our kids, anything north of prison is just fine." But our kids have it made. Court kids are a disaster. Ms. Hudson, you know that. You spent many a day in the court. These children that we see in abuse neglect court suffer all kinds of neglect. Anything that you can imagine exists. They suffer physical abuse. And they suffer sexual abuse. And some of those cases are really, really tough. I'll never forget the case I had here. It's been a while ago. It was two brothers. There were only about 10 or 8 at the time. They lived in a trailer park here in Scotland County. And the younger one of them, actually had the audacity to change the radio station. This is when everybody listened to FM radio, I guess. And the older one's favorite song was playing. And he got mad. He's only 10 years old. What did he do? He picked up his dad's 12-gauge shotgun, pointed it at his brother's face from about 3 feet away, and pulled the trigger. Those pictures, you can imagine how terrible they were. But we had 2 victims. We had the brother that was killed, and we had a 10-year-old. We tried everything we could to help that boy. Unfortunately, time goes on, and when you're a judge for 26 years, you get to see the results of these things. He has spent the rest of his life in and out of prison, and quite frankly, I couldn't tell you right now where he is or what's going on. 20 years I did the abuse neglect cases in Scotland County and Hope County. And there came a time after 20 years that I had a case that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't the worst case that I'd ever seen, not by any stretch of the imagination, but for some reason it just got to me. It was a little girl who was an elementary school student. She went to school, and her teacher, very observant, like all our good teachers are, noticed she had some bad bruising on the back of her ankle. So she took her to the office, and when they took her pants off, she was totally black and blue from that ankle all the way to her hip. And of course they asked her what happened, and she said, "My mom did it." But her mom didn't do it. That was what her mom told her to say if somebody noticed it. Who really did it was the mom's boyfriend. So we had both the mom and the child the victims of the domestic violence. But that's not what got me. What got me was when the little girl got to DSS and the social worker, and the social worker explained that they were going to find a nice home for her to go to, and they were going to fix a wonderful dinner. She looked at him and said, "Can my mommy come too?" And for some reason, that was it. I think you can see from my experience in court that here in Scotland County, we have a tremendous need for mental health counseling. But what resources do we have to address that need? For our children, we have had in the past and continue to have state money that comes to Scotland County, and it's administered by our Juvenile Crime Prevention Council. Some of you may be familiar with that. That Juvenile Crime Prevention Council at one point in time was called Community-Based Alternatives, and it goes back to the early 80s. And that was actually before I was a judge, but when I was asked to serve on that committee, I thought, this is great. The state of North Carolina sends us a bundle of money, and they trust those of us locally who presumably know what our kids need to figure out how best to spend it. I always wanted to grow up to be a philanthropist. And I thought, this is my chance to be a philanthropist. But the reality of it is, and I saw this especially when I became a judge, there are certain things that you have to have in your court system when you do juvenile cases. Every time you make a placement of a child outside of his or her home, you have to have a psychological assessment. When those kids commit property crimes, we want them to pay restitution. And in order for them to earn the money to pay restitution, we have to have them do community service. If you throw in a parenting class here and then, you've basically spent all of the money that the state has given us, and there's nothing left over for doing anything that would be close to innovative. I would be remiss if I didn't say, speaking to this group, that I think the next biggest resource we have for counseling in Scotland County is our faith community. Scotland Family Counseling is a faith-based service, and when I think about that, Sherry and I have been real involved over the years in our Laurinburg-Oban Sister City program. It's a great program. Both of our kids participated, and I guess you would say Sherry and I participated. We went as chaperones. But when those kids from Oban come here, the kids and the chaperones and the teachers every year say the same thing. What is the story in Scotland County? You have a church on every block. I don't think that's exactly true, but if you compare Scotland County to Oban, Scotland, it really is. You just don't see a lot of churches there. But we have them, and in my mind, every single one of those churches is a veritable gold mine when it comes to providing help for people. Over the course of my career as a judge, probably the biggest resource we had for a long time, or the best part of it, was our public mental health program. And while it wasn't perfect, there were some good things about that. In the good old days, I guess you would say, that public mental health service functioned as an immediate crisis service. Anybody could walk into the Scotland County Mental Health Office and they could get help. And that was true regardless of their income and regardless of whether they had any insurance. And not only would they get help, but the people there would make a real effort to bring in a treatment team to help you with your issues. Now, there were some negative things about that. And the single biggest negative, I thought, was the caseloads for those therapists were absolutely crushing. And as a result of that, I think we had a really hard time keeping therapists here in Scotland County. As a judge in court, nothing was worse than to finally convince a family, you need to go and you need to talk to this person and you need to bring and develop a relationship with this person. And then they do, and that therapist leaves. Well, that's the problem that most of them had to begin with, is that people keep walking out on them in their lives. So that was really, really tough. Plus, the demands were so great that therapy became essentially a crisis care management. And it was really nothing more than a triage service. So, it was actually 2001. Doesn't seem like that was that early, but our legislature, in its infinite wisdom, decided that we would do away with our public mental health program and institute privatization. Well, actually, it took several years, I think, for all of that to happen, but they promised that everybody would have more choices and everybody would get more personal attention In reality, what they're doing is saving money. And they saved a little money. But the results, in my opinion, have not been good. The accessibility aspect of all of our mental health services just became confused. And while there were a myriad of services, all of those providers, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes here, needed clients who first could help them keep their lights on, and second, would minimize their liability if something went wrong. So the end result, in my opinion, was that poor people, working people, and middle-class people, which is essentially Scotland County, ended up with very limited choices about where to get mental health. Norrin Sanford, who I talked with about some of this before I spoke, and somebody who I respect very much, told me, and I didn't realize this, and a lot of you do, that there is no federal mandate for health insurance to cover mental health issues, which seems to me to be just inexcusable. But all of that brings me to why we're here today in Scotland Family Counseling. And I've looked at a lot of the literature that Charles provided to me for this speech. And I love what I see. Here's who Scotland Family Counseling serves: individuals, families, couples, children, and adolescents. Here are the issues that are being addressed: anxiety, depression, marital problems, spiritual issues, parenting concerns, grief and loss, trauma, PTSD, blended families, stress management, and substance abuse. In 2015, Scotland Family Counseling provided 2,686 hours of service from, and I know this personally, 3 great counselors. I think that's a wonderful program. And in fact, in conclusion, while this is my first foray into public speaking since I retired, I think this program is so... Charles, where are you? Charles, I'm going to donate half of my $100,000 speaking fee back to your program.